Hello, everyone. Welcome to our folks in person, to our folks online. We're glad to have you here. We're not so glad for the subject we're talking about, but we're glad that we do get to have this conversation, raise awareness about the Bank Secrecy Act, or the BSA as it's often abbreviated, because this is a piece of legislation that has ballooned into an entire surveillance regime. Over 55 years of surveillance steadily increasing into our financial lives. So today, I'm here with Naomi Brockwell and Norbert Michel to talk about what this is, what this means, how it impacts all of us, what it means to think that you have financial privacy in a world that really hasn't had any privacy. So first, some housekeeping though. For anyone who might not be familiar, my name's Nicholas Anthony. I work at the Cato Institute Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. Naomi is a journalist who specializes in financial, well, really all privacy. She's been working for years now on NBTV. You can find it on YouTube, and also now at the Ludlow Institute. You can find all of her work showing people not just how privacy has been lost, but also how you can reclaim it in easy and, frankly, fun ways. And Norbert Michel is my boss here at Cato. He's a vice president as well as the director of the center I work in. And he works on a little bit of everything in the financial realm. And so before we get started, I'll just say we'll have questions near the end, so keep anything in mind if anything comes up that seems strange, odd, or you want more information on. And to all the folks who are tuning in online, you can submit questions on the webpage, on Facebook, YouTube, X, and we'll get to those as well. So, kicking it off, Norbert,
Yes.
55 years.
Yes.
That's a long time.
I know, it's almost my age.
Almost. What started this? What got this off the ground in the first place? Because a lot has changed since then.
Quite a bit, yes. This is actually one of my favorite issues, if not my most favorite issue that I work on, and partly because of the history. The bill actually is a couple of bills, and everybody just kind of calls it the Bank Secrecy Act, but it was the brainchild of somebody named Wright Patman, and he was at the time, in the 60s, the chairman of what is now the House Financial Services Committee. It's a different name, but same committee. And he was sort of known as the last populist, and that was a bit premature, clearly. But that's another event. But he held two hearings, one in 1968, one in 1969, and then introduced the bill in 69 that became what we're calling the Bank Secrecy Act. And the premise was that Americans are using foreign banking institutions to hide money, to do all kinds of illegal things, evade taxes, commit securities fraud. There were a long list of things. Importers from Vietnamese, money laundering, and
So is this the depending on you ask, famous or infamous Swiss bank accounts?
yes, it is. It is, and it turns out that he said he was going to implement or introduce a bill rather to deal with that and to make those things illegal, to make dealing with those foreign banks illegal, and to make those foreign banks have to deal with our regulations and so on and so on. And they did none of that. So and as you read through, and we have a whole paper that kind of summarizes this. But if you read through the whole hearing, either of those hearings, you see that even some of the members of Congress at the time said, "Well, this isn't what you said you were going to do." And you have these domestic reporting transactions, and the bill that ended up being reported, it had if you were going to transfer either in or out of the United States $5,000, that had to be reported. And it also had financial record keeping requirements, and then it also had other domestic cash reporting requirements, but that was left up to Treasury to figure out what those thresholds would be and exactly what that would look like. So they left a lot of authority in the executive branch, and a lot of members objected to that, but nobody had enough strength or power to get any of that stuff squashed and the bill passed. And Treasury ended up writing a regulation, so we had the $10,000 threshold on currency transaction reports. That threshold has never changed. That's the equivalent of about $80,000. So the thinking was kind of like, well, yeah, we're doing this, and maybe there's some privacy concerns, but this is a really large amount of money. And it's never going to catch up with like just the average person. This is this really large companies and cartels, and well, it's still $10,000, and there's a whole bunch of other thresholds. And maybe I won't go that far into this to open it up, but maybe that's kind of what happened.
Well, I guess to recap that though, is it fair to boil it down and say that the original Bank Secrecy Act started with this idea of the government was worried about Swiss bank accounts,
yes,
and then slowly veered into now we're going to make people report what they hold abroad, also report $10,000 or larger transactions, and then also banks need to keep firmer records and start watching people closely.
Well, and I'll put maybe I should, this is a little bit maybe commentary, too much commentary, but I think it was done under the premise of there's these Swiss bank accounts and we can't get access to anything, we being the US law enforcement, so we need to do something about it. And it turns out that's not true either. And even in the hearing, US attorney said, well, it's not really that we can't get a warrant for this stuff, it's just that it takes a little too long. So as a result, where we are now is we have all these rules, regulations, and statutory, the statutory framework where your financial records in any financial institution, not just your bank, broker-dealer, and about 20 other types of businesses, your financial records are not private. And law enforcement can get your financial records without a warrant. No search warrant is necessary. So that's kind of where we are. I think that's maybe a better setup than what I started with.
Well, one thing that you started with that is really important to put a point on is that we talk about this as the Bank Secrecy Act, or sometimes we call it the Bank Secrecy Act regime. And it started in 1970, but then over the years, whether it be the war on drugs, the war on terror, or something else entirely, it's just increased with more bills passed, more regulations created. And so it's steadily gotten larger and larger and larger under this umbrella. And one place that is probably even more well-known than the Bank Secrecy Act is the Patriot Act. And that's something that really caught people's attention. Naomi, can you break down what that played in this role? So we've gone from 1970, fast forward to 2001. Where did this take us?
Yeah, and so I'll just mention before we get to the Patriot Act, when you're talking about this just growing, I think another really pivotal moment that came just before and then they added to it in the Patriot Act was the Annunzio Wiley Anti-Money Laundering Act, 1992, where you took this $10,000 reporting requirement and said, okay, this is the reporting requirements. Just when there's an egregious amount of money, life-changing amount, like you could buy a house with cash for this. That's the threshold. And then they said, let's introduce a thing called SARS. It's suspicious activity reports, and if you think something is suspicious, just report it. And that kind of changed the game because it took like a threshold, $10,000, and said, now we're going to just leave it up to your subjective judgment. If you think something is suspicious, then give us the information. That was a game changer. They also introduced all kinds of liability waivers at this time, these safe harbors. And then the Patriot Act just double down on these safe harbors. So what we got with the Patriot Act, and it's obviously infamous for being absolutely terrible for privacy and just really expanded this Orwellian surveillance state that we're continuing to grow. First of all, it brought intelligence into it. It was kind of this marriage with the intelligence community. Before these suspicious activity reports, they were kind of overseen by Treasury and could be shared with law enforcement. But we're meant to have all of these barriers between, which government departments are allowed access to information. And one of the things that the Patriot Act did did was really break down these barriers and said, yes, there could be a lot more information sharing in all of these departments. And KYC was another thing that the Patriot Act was really responsible for. It formalized it. You know, before the Patriot Act, banks were really responsible for their own risk management, for their own requirements. You know, if someone wants to open a bank account, it was up to the bank to decide what sort of documentation do we need. Well, we've known Betty since she's 5 years old, and her parents have had an account with us for 20 years. Like, they probably don't need that much documentation. They've known this family for forever. The government stepped in and said, no, we're going to nationalize and standardize this system with the Patriot Act. So we have all of these reporting requirements. You need to, you know, collect ID documents. You need to be able to keep them safe, which no one has ever been able to do since. And so it just kind of standardized these thresholds. And so I think, like, there's some really big things that came into play. And these safe harbors that were given to the banks with this reporting when they brought the intelligence community in said, you now have to share this information with the intelligence community. But we don't want you to be legally liable for this. So we're going to make it so no customer can ever sue you for sharing this information. So we went from a system where we had checks and balances, and we had 1970, where, you know, even the New York Times is talking about how unconstitutional the Bank Secrecy Act was at the time. You had the Supreme Court saying, this is probably unconstitutional, but it's such an egregious amount of money, this $10,000. We're going to let it slide. If it ever increases, we'll revisit it, which they never did. So we went from these checks and balances. Oh, yeah, you have something to say about that. But we went from these checks and balances, and it's meant to be that the government can't get our information without a warrant. And we had these safeguards in place. And since this Bank Secrecy Act regime has come in and just grown and expanded with inflation and everything else, we now have a system where the government has mandated that banks collect all this information about us, mandated that they share this information with law enforcement and the intelligence community, and made them completely liable so no one can ever push back against this egregious data sharing. I mean, that's a complete violation of the Fourth Amendment as far as I'm concerned. But
Agree. No, I agree completely. And Justices Gorsuch and Sotomayor have indicated a willingness to revisit this now, finally. But that's just them indicating a willingness to do it. So we're still not there. And then I just wanted to point out one other thing on the bank side in terms of their safe harbors. Naomi's right. But what makes this even stranger is that the banks still get fined an enormous amount of money when something goes wrong. And there's absolutely no way to expect anybody, even law enforcement, to be perfect, right? And to never mess up and to never miss anything. Mm-hmm. Well, it makes even less sense to expect somebody who's not in law enforcement to never mess anything up. Mm-hmm. So here you have a situation where you have large financial institutions who have federal regulators inside of those businesses every day. They have offices there every single day. And they certify that these programs, these Bank Secrecy Act and Know Your Customer, KYC programs, that they're fine, that they're legitimate, and that they meet the standards. Then something goes wrong, and then they get fined. And they get fined by one federal regulator, and then another federal regulator, and then maybe even another federal regulator on top of that. And they're just piling on. So there's nothing about the system that makes any sense, really. We haven't even gotten into the reporting piece and the costs and benefits, but.
And then just add on to that. So to sum up the Patriot Act, I would just say that really the financial industry, it was the point where it became solidified as a tool, a mass surveillance tool for the government. You had private businesses being conscripted to become investigatory agents. They have liability if they miss things. They're mandated to do all of this collection. They're not compensated for all of the extra costs incurred from all of this. And really, they just became another wing of the government when it comes to the surveillance state.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's as if the Fourth Amendment doesn't exist.
As if. Maybe to lay this out, though, I think it is really important to stress how all the incentives are in the wrong direction. All of them are against all of us as far as how banks operate in this space. So what you've just heard is that they have a safe harbor. If they share something with the government and they did it in good faith, they thought you were doing something wrong, it's okay. They can't get in trouble. You cannot have any sort of recourse for that. Then also, if they don't report enough, they can get fined for this. And we're talking millions, if not billions of dollars. So both of those are pushing this in the direction of just report everything under the sun and play it safe. And then you have all these different forms of reports that come out. So we've talked about currency transaction reports being at the $10,000 level, but the most common report for suspicious activity that Naomi mentioned is that you got near $10,000. It's not that you actually did something wrong. I mean, by that logic, I do suspicious things all the time. And frankly, all of us do. All of us have done strange things. I mean, think about it from a bank's perspective. All of a sudden, you pay your bills all the time. Maybe you use your debit card to buy food, but that's it. And all of a sudden, you spent $3,000, $5,000, $10,000. That's weird. That's suspicious. That's something that raises an eyebrow. But it could be something as simple as a pipe burst in your basement and you needed to call an emergency plumber to come out. Yet the way this system has been designed, the way that it has been built up, is effectively punishing that. Is anything that's just outside the norm gets roped up in it because all the incentives are towards over-reporting, sharing as much as possible and hoping that nothing goes wrong. Now, one last thing I do want to ask you on the Patriot Act is, why do you think it caught so many people's attention? Like, there were protests in the street. The name is now infamous. It's something that people actually know really around the world. Why was this such a turning point in the privacy conversation for people in the United States and abroad as well?
Yeah, well, there's a few things to unpack in that. I'm not sure it was a turning point. I just see the continuation of the surveillance state continuing to grow since that. And it's almost like people have these moments of being awakened, and then they just go back to sleep again. And then they'll be awakened by the Snowden revelations, and then they go back to sleep. And then they're awakened by the next thing. I would say that the Patriot Act definitely stood out. It was an omnibus bill that no one had a chance to read. They said, you know, we've got to pass this, and then we'll be able to see what's in it. And so when they started to dive into it, I mean, you know, they say that this was just sitting on a shelf, collecting dust, waiting for the right crisis to come along when someone could say, now is the opportunity, we will seize it, and then create our amazing surveillance state. And that's basically what they did, because the egregious overreach when it came to data collection is not just the financial industry. I mean, there's so much baked into the Patriot Act, and they used terrorism as the excuse to say, this is why we need all of this. Don't worry, it's just a crisis. This is a temporary measure. And we've seen how temporary this measure has been. You know, we're still reauthorizing all of these provisions in the Patriot Act. Like every few years, we're just adding them back in, these so-called temporary measures. I would say then in the privacy conversation, what is alarming is just, it's called shifting baseline syndrome. So this idea that in 1970, everyone was up in arms about the unconstitutionality of a $10,000 reporting limit. They were worried about that. And today, you swipe your piece of plastic, and there are so many entities that get your data. There's the payment processor, the credit card provisioner, the bank, the government, law enforcement, you've got intelligence community, you've got data brokers who are buying this. It's not illegal for the banks to be selling your data. Did you know that? And so many people are just collecting every piece of information. And I don't see people being super cognizant of it. You know, it's like they go back to sleep after each of these moments of revelation. And I think that what we need to do as a society is give people alternatives. Like what I found is that for me, the work that we do at our research institute is not so much revelatory. It's not to have those like aha moments, because we've learned people have the aha moment and then they forget about it until the next aha moment. What actually is creating change is if you say, here's the aha moment, and here are the tools you can use to change it. If you get them in that moment of revelation and you actually say, this is actually how you can solve something, you can get them to make one small change at a time, slowly reclaim their data, reclaim their privacy, reclaim their autonomy, sovereignty. If you don't have viable alternatives, people are just overwhelmed, and they just continue to get overwhelmed. And then the next data breach is announced, and everyone's like, well, okay, another data breach. I'm kind of overwhelmed at this stage. What am I meant to do about it? My information's out there. Privacy's dead. And so I just think it's so important to remind people that there's so much they can do. When it comes to privacy as well, within the traditional banking system, there's a lot that's mandated. But we now have all of these decentralized financial tools that can let you completely live a life free from all of this egregious overreach and data collection. So, I mean, you guys study a lot of this stuff in your amazing department. So,
thank you. That is one silver lining in this space, is that there are so many options and so many people like you who are working to make those options more accessible and make them more understandable, because it does take an extra step or two. But then when you realize the costs that are weighing on us now and the benefits that are just within reach, it becomes so clear.
I feel like a little rebel when I'm at a cafe and everyone's swiping their card, and I give my order, the barista walks away, I'm like, no, I will be paying with cash. Have you heard of this before? I take out my Coinbase. It actually gives me a moment of joy to know that I can pay for my morning matcha and 10,000 entities don't get access to that data. Why? Not because I'm doing anything wrong, but because it's none of their business. They don't need to know what I'm drinking for coffee. So I would encourage you, cash is something we all can get access to. Any chance you can, just let's revitalize some of that in our daily lives. Let's get people back to things that immediately allow them to reclaim their autonomy and financial sovereignty. The problem with the surveillance system is that it's a system of control. When people know what you're spending your money on, which political causes you're supporting, which charities you're supporting, which social groups you hang out with, who's in your social graph, your daily activities, all of these things, you become very visible to them. And in a free society, you really need the ability to have privacy to continue to do things that government may not like. It may not be illegal, but the government may not like it. They may not like you going to that opposition party meeting. They may not like you, supporting a certain cause that is politically unfavorable. But it is your right to do things and to vote with your money and to make your own choices. And I just think we need to remind society that they can just reclaim that right.
And it's sad that there are, unfortunately, no shortage of examples of those cases going on where people have been targeted, and so easily in the digital era. And we just see it again and again. And it's something that we see across the world as well, especially in more hostile, more authoritarian regimes. And one thing I want to mention, though, on the note of how our perspectives get shifted or how our tolerance gets shifted, is a more recent example is that of people were up in arms, and rightly so, when the Biden administration proposed surveilling as little as $600 in a bank account. Senators and members of the House wrote bills to stop this. It was headlines in popular news. There were op-eds. There were think tanks that were working on it. I was working on it. And that ended up getting pushed away. Mind you, it came back in different forms, but it mostly got pushed away. And now under the Trump administration, a proposal came out to do almost the same thing at $200, and a lot of that air had completely fell out. And I think you're right that it was some of that perspective had changed, where people had been kind of warmed up to it in a way. It's a little different that it's limited to the southern border, so there's not as many people directly affected. But still, it surprises me that sometimes I feel like one of the only people talking about this, when before it was what lit the town on fire. I mean, thank goodness the Institute for Justice has been there to push back at this in the courts and get this frozen. But at the same time, I just can't help but wonder, where is the outrage? Mm-hmm. And where are members of Congress speaking out, or why aren't they speaking out against this? And I think part of that is, unfortunately, those scales get shifted and we just get warmed up to another degree.
I think we do get desensitized too quickly. And another piece of this, I think, is just a lack of information. And I don't just mean the general public. There was a hearing in the Judiciary Committee last year, I believe it was last year, on sort of like a Bank Secrecy Act controversy surrounding the January 6th protest, or whatever you want to call that, at the Capitol. And I mean, there were members of Congress on the Judiciary Committee who did not actually understand what was legal under the Bank Secrecy Act. So there's an enormous information problem as well in terms of exactly what this stuff does and what it doesn't do. And it's not just the average American that is lacking on what's going on here.
Well, this is by design. I mean, the Annuncio Wiley Anti-Money Laundering Act, it used to be when the Bank Secrecy Act came into play, again, completely different context. You were allowed to sue the government. You were allowed recourse. If, your data was collected and it caused you harm or, whatever, you had recourse there. And the Annuncio Wiley Anti-Money Laundering Act made it illegal for banks to tell you when they file a suspicious activity report about you. So surveillance works so much better in secret, and that's why there's an informational problem. It's by design. Governments do not want you to know what kind of data collection is going on because it wouldn't be as effective for them. The same with corporations. I mean, governments are one of the largest clients of data brokers. Corporations don't want to tell you what kind of data collection is going on or what data they're selling directly to the government, again, because if you knew, you probably wouldn't choose that service. So this whole shrouded in secrecy that we have to deal with when it comes to surveillance, it's absolutely by design, and we should be clamoring to get more visibility into all of this. We absolutely need more people to be doing research into this and teaching people.
That's what we do.
Well, thank you. I mean, you're saying you guys are one of the few people speaking out about this threshold. Thank you for speaking out.
And the Fourth Amendment is important. I mean, these are exactly the kinds of things that the Fourth Amendment was put there to protect us from. And going further than just the data collection and types of data collections. I mean, I'm not kidding. There were members of Congress who don't understand that law enforcement doesn't have to get a warrant to get access to your financial records.
And frankly, most people don't know that, though. They
true.
have a higher obligation, but most people don't know that.
No, that's true.
Because when we surveyed the American public,
Very few people.
It was something like 80% of people thought that the government needs a warrant to get their bank account. And they said it would be completely unreasonable for the bank to share their records with the government. And mind you, that's exactly the opposite of what the Supreme Court said. The Supreme Court said it's unreasonable to expect privacy. You go to your bank, you close the door behind you, you sit down, maybe you talk in hushed voices. When you get your bank statement, you shred it, you have multiple passwords, all these things where you're trying to protect the security of your information. And yet, it's unreasonable for you to expect privacy. And the flip side of it is, it seems that they can expect privacy because, as you said, they've made much of this completely confidential. Banks can't tell you what transaction made them file a SAR, a suspicious activity report. They can't even tell you that that report exists in the first place. So all of us are left in the dark. Maybe you had one because a transaction took too long or longer than usual to go through because they had froze it to look through what was going on, but you're really not going to see many other hints about it. And that makes it incredibly difficult to reach members of Congress because constituents are feeling the costs of it, but they don't know it. They don't know that that's what's going on. They don't know that that's why they've had their account closed, or something costs so much because there has to be all this compliance that goes on behind the scenes, or they don't know that they've been put on some sort of list. And because of that, members of Congress look to other things. And it's really unfortunate because they are some of the few people who have access and can peer behind the curtain. They can get into a secure room and see some of what's going on behind the scenes here. And even when we ask them to, the few that we've gotten to do that, they don't get any answers. Wow. They don't get told, is this working? Is this doing anything? Are we catching criminals? Is all this money getting somewhere useful? We're having our rights sacrificed. What is the benefit? And maybe to bring it
I know
up,
the answer, Nick.
well, that's perfect because I was going to turn to you. We skipped previously from the BSA to 2001, so 20, 30 years. We're going to do that again.
Okay.
Where are we now, Norbert?
It's a mess. We have basically a system that says, okay, we're going to make people try to find a needle in a haystack, but before we let them go try to find it, we're just going to keep dumping hay on top of it for about a year. And then they'll go try to find the needle in the haystack. We have millions, tens of millions of reports every year that basically just sit in the warehouse like the Raiders of the Lost Ark scene. They're just doing absolutely nothing. Literally 30 million reports a year, and we're talking about for roughly 1,000 per year convictions on AML and Bank Secrecy Act type violations. And that even includes tax evasion, which isn't necessarily a Bank Secrecy Act violation, right? So that's being generous. So we're talking about spending anywhere from like $100 to $200 million per conviction for implementing like tens of billions of dollars of cost on Americans. We don't have to say businesses, just on Americans. And it's hard to put a cost number on you don't have a Fourth Amendment protection anymore, but that's in there too, for virtually no benefit.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really it. And we even have statutory requirements for the federal government to say, okay, this is how this works. This is how these things are helping us. And still, after that, and after congressmen pointing that out and requiring the information and asking for additional information, to say, okay, how did these reports lead to this conviction? We still don't have that information.
I should have been clear about that. It's not just members of Congress are going over to the Treasury, knocking on a door and saying, hey, can you give us some insights on this? Can you give us some information here? It's by law. In 2020, there was a law enacted that said you are required to provide this information. You're required to tell us, is it working? What's going on?
And specifically how.
And year after year, this information just doesn't come out. They just keep saying, oh, we're working on it.
This is like, maybe this is a little in the weeds, but so when the 2020 stuff came out, the beneficial ownership requirements. So that was a bill that was kicking around for quite a while, and it was actually one of the ones that got me interested in this topic. It had been out for years, and the idea was that we were going to make businesses affirmatively report who their beneficial owners were instead of the banks. So previously, the banks would have to do that, and that was fine, and then all of a sudden it wasn't. And so people like me started asking, well, wait a minute, what are we doing? Because that information's already there. And if you're going to tell me that you need this to catch a tax cheat, I mean, like, I'm shrugging my shoulders because, I mean, tax fraud is tax fraud. And if somebody's reporting their taxes, then they're doing it under their name. So there's a lot of misinformation with all of that, right? So, and all of a sudden, we were in a situation where, yeah, we're just going to do this. We're just going to shift the burden onto the companies and the people, and take it off of the banks, and leave out the commentary, right? But that's what we did. And when we were doing that, and we were having these discussions with staff, we said, people like me, again, would say things like, well, all that information's already there. If you need beneficial ownership information, IRS has it. And the banking committee would say, those staffers would say, well, that's another committee. That's in a different jurisdiction. So we can't, and then all the sharing that goes on, we're not going to do that sharing.
We draw the line.
Right, that's too much. That's too much sharing. So we're not going to do that. And what we're going to do is just have this new requirement put in place. It is absolutely absurd. The benefits are virtually nothing. They'll tell you that this whole thing was done to prevent people from using shell companies. Ask them to define shell company, they can't. Then you go through that whole explanation, and then what you learn is that that's exactly what the Bank Secrecy Act was supposed to take care of in 1970. And that's why the information was there with the IRS. So it's absolutely insane. There are so many pieces of this that are illogical. It's almost all counterproductive. Banks are going to keep records anyway. You know, I mean, like we could keep going on and on and on. But the cost-benefit analysis is very easy to do. The costs far outweigh the benefit. And we've been asking the agencies that run this stuff to show us the benefit for decades, and they can't even do it. So it's pretty clear.
It is pretty egregious when you have something as sensitive as this, where it is intruding into our private lives. Our financial lives reveal so much about us, and they can't do the decency of making a sound argument, of saying, here is the evidence that while I am intruding, it's actually fixing something to a huge degree. And we don't even get that, which makes it all the more painful that we have this steady history of expansion after expansion after expansion after expansion, whether it's to catch people who do something suspicious, or catch people for having too many businesses, or catching people because they use cryptocurrency now. It's just constantly been expanded on here, and we just don't see where the benefits are coming out of it. Unfortunately, the harsh reality is that crime persists, and you can't have this total surveillance state where, like one example is, theoretically, it might put a damper in crime if we all had a government attendant that was with us 24/7. Maybe that would help, but we also have to look at that and see that's an enormous cost. That's an unfathomable cost, especially with the costs we're already facing. So that's clearly out the window. And while that can be seen as absurd and ridiculous,
ideas.
Right.
While that can be seen as absurd,
Newsflash tomorrow. All people must have a government agent with them.
but it's sad that the same can't be said of what's been created here. This mountain, this huge mountain of hay that they're trying to get the needle from. But before I go on, let me remind folks, we'll probably jump into questions in a few minutes, and for folks online, you can submit any questions you have on the webpage for the event, on social media like Facebook, X, or YouTube. Norbert, you were going to jump in, though.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Well, so on that note, though, Naomi, what do you think the future looks like? You've talked about how people can reclaim their privacy with the oldest of technology and the newest of technology, and I know you're very much in the conversation of where things are headed. What do you think is the future from the individual point of view, from the consumer point of view?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of battles we could be fighting, lots of fronts we could be fighting this battle on. I applaud the people who have the patience for the political battles, because I absolutely don't. And the idea of kowtowing to politicians to get rights that should be mine in the first place just makes me a little bit ill. So I really like solutions that are easily accessible to people, that allow them to just reclaim their rights. They don't have to ask permission to get access to their bank account. They can just hold their own money. I just love tech as a solution to this. And we're kind of at a juncture right now, because technology is neutral. And tech can be used for good or bad. Unfortunately, it has been hijacked for decades now as part of the surveillance apparatus. And we're at a critical juncture where surveillance is getting so bad that we have to decide what kind of a future we're going to write. Are we going to lean into the tech that is going to help protect individuals, or are we going to continue to fuel the surveillance ecosystem, use products that are fueling the surveillance ecosystem? Are we going to send that market signal and use the products from companies that are trying to protect us? It's a decision we all have to make as individuals, and the future is not yet written. It's really up to us and which path we decide to take. As far as I'm concerned, I have never been more excited about the privacy technology that I'm seeing, because we have all kinds of amazing tools out there. I mean, you look at some of the threats we're facing right now with centralization of power. We've got censorship, right? That's a big one, and controlling the narrative. Well, we have decentralized technology that allows people to, basically run. It gets quite technical, but imagine a situation where you could use social media and you couldn't be silenced because the entire infrastructure is decentralized. Well, that's pretty exciting. When no government could chime in and say, well, actually, just censor that video. We don't want people knowing about that. Don't censor what happened in this place in 1989. We wouldn't allow governments to have control over that anymore. So that's exciting. You look at that in the financial sphere. We have decentralized technology there that's helping people. You no longer need to actually have someone else control your money. It used to be a service that banks were providing for us. If I wanted to send money, over to Australia, I need to use traditional financial payment rails to do that. I have to opt into the system. I have to have a bank account to use that. I don't have to do that anymore. We have the technology that allows me to do it directly. I can send it peer-to-peer to anyone in the world instantaneously. That's pretty cool. We're at a stage now where we actually can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, and people haven't quite come to terms with the power dynamics and how much they've shifted. But we have a lot of incredibly empowering technology. I'm looking at protests in Iran recently, and how the government there shut down private communication, and because the internet has a lot of centralized facets to it. Okay, so we made a tutorial teaching people how to create signal proxy servers so that you could just bypass all the chokeholds that the Iranian government had, so people can continue to protest. So there are all kinds of ways that we can lean into this incredible technology. Like, if governments want to do KYC and all of that, I'm not a fan of that at all, but if they had to do it, there's privacy technology like zero knowledge proofs, there's homomorphic encryption. There are things that would allow them to be able to prove someone is who they say they are without ever revealing the underlying data. That's how cool the privacy technology and encryption technology is today. We have so much at our disposal. But governments are choosing the easy way out. As you said, like, they could get a warrant, but it's just a little hard. They could use this privacy-enhancing technology and protect all of our rights. There would be no question of overreach with the Fourth Amendment. We could protect all of that, enable those checks and balances. But they don't do it. So right now, we're at this juncture. I don't know what the future will hold. If people continue to be complacent about the state of surveillance, we will get to a point where you cannot protest. There is no dissent. There are no opposition parties. There are no investigative journalists. There are no people pushing back against overreach. And we've lost every mechanism for a self-correcting society. Because that's what happens with totalitarian surveillance. And you can see that all over the world, where the tipping point has just gone that little bit too far. So we have to decide as a society whether we are okay with that happening. And if we are not, we need to stop being complacent about the current situation with privacy. We need to start using tools and fueling the systems that people are trying to build to protect us. And we need to stop fueling all of the services that they have a direct line of data transfer with the government. And so I just think it's up to us, essentially, what future we want to write.
I think that's maybe what makes me the most optimistic, is that there's tools out there. I mean, Signal has become such a commonly used tool. Then there's even more niche things like Vexel or eCash by Cato, and even, frankly, your videos, making it easier to understand that there is a market, that there are people who tune in all the time. I'm actually curious, on the note of your videos, have you noticed, is there any tool, or is there any maybe category of privacy that has really been like the most useful for people, or you get the most views on? perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what your risk scenario is. My favorite tool is my phone right here. I don't have a SIM card in it. I'm running Graphene OS on it. I use a Calix hotspot I paid for anonymously with Zcash to get internet when I need it, but I don't always need it. I'm usually just taking notes or taking pictures. Why do I need to have my phone chattering in the background to everything? So this is my personal favorite tool. I think the Graphene team is incredible. The most helpful things for people are super beginner stuff, because everyone's at the beginner level here. Even the software engineers who are all working in the tech space, they're at the beginning when it comes to privacy, and they're not thinking about this stuff. So the top 5 things I say to people if they just want to start, okay, which browser are you using? Stop using Chrome, use something like Brave browser. Which search engine are you using? Stop using Google, use something like Brave Search or Pre-Search or Start Page. Are you using a VPN? You could be hiding your IP address from the websites you visit. I recommend Proton VPN or Malvad. They're very easy tools. There's a lot of scamware out there, so be careful. Email, are you using Gmail? Okay, well, they're analyzing every private communication you have ever sent, adding to a profile, spraying it out to thousands of ad partners who are then taking that and selling that to who knows who, and also giving it to the government. So they're building these profiles about you that ends up in government hands. Stop using Gmail. Use something like Proton Mail. Mail is just a great thing to switch over. You get huge benefits. And then you mentioned Signal, private messaging. If you're still using SMS, if you're using social media DMs to communicate with people, okay, all of that is being aggregated. It is being added to a profile about you. And every person you're communicating with, you are putting them in a situation where that information is being collected about them too. I have hard privacy boundaries. I probably make the people in my life angry about this, but I'm at a situation now where if you want to contact me, you have to use Signal. And if you don't have it, that's just a privacy boundary that I don't cross. I mean, I interviewed this woman from Bahrain who's an activist there, and she's in a life and death situation because she's a dissident against a government that is very angry at dissidents. So for her, privacy is a matter of life and death. And so she has school friends who will try to message her on SMS or some other insecure platform, Instagram DMs. And she'll say, you cannot talk to me on this. And they say, why? It's just lunch details. And her friends don't understand that every bit of information that can be collected about her, it can be weaponized against her. It helps this very hostile government understand how to profile her, understand her daily activities, map out her social graph. So she's had to draw a really strong line and just say, no, I can only communicate privately, otherwise you're actually putting my life in danger. And so I think that it's okay to have privacy boundaries and to just decide how much information you want to give away. For me, privacy is not about hiding, it's about control. It's about you just reclaiming the right to decide for yourself who gets your data. You don't have to just use all of the things we've always used. You don't have to agree with the status quo and keep going along with it. You can actually make empowered choices and just reclaim your data if you want to. You absolutely have the tools to do that right now.
That's such an important point, that privacy is not about hiding. It's about having the say of what happens to your information. Where does that go? Who gets to know what about you? Norbert, before we turn to questions.
I do know what Signal is.
Optimistic or pessimistic? What are you seeing for the future?
Oh, man. On the one hand, since I'm an economist, I'm a bit pessimistic because I think that we still have it pretty good in the United States. In other words, most people don't have to worry explicitly about something happening to them, so they don't. On the other hand, I am very optimistic because of the work we do here, because of people like Naomi pointing these things out, and I feel as though that the information level has gone in a good direction. For the first time in my lifetime, there have been multiple bills introduced in Congress to radically amend the Bank Secrecy Act itself. That's the first time that's happened ever. There was a bill was passed in 1978, but it had so many exceptions in it that it really didn't do anything. So this would really curb that. So I'm optimistic in that regard, and I'm optimistic in that people seem to pay more attention, ironically on social media. But I am, generally speaking, more on the optimistic side with a caveat.
That is an important point, and one that I'm kind of mixed, but I am optimistic on the note of just more people are taking notice, more tools are available, and they're more accessible than ever before. That is a really nice thing. But I'd like to turn to questions in here, if we have any. Yes, sir, over here. Or wait 1 second, I'm sorry, the microphone's coming over to you.
Hi, my name is Joe Benning. I wrote my dissertation about money laundering, so I want to ask you to comment on two things. One, when you're talking about costs and benefits, I understand the argument with respect to aggregate costs and benefits, but if you're talking about the consumer level, I would ask you to comment on this. Aren't consumers more interested in transactional convenience than hiding their data? That's the first. And secondly, I went to an anti-money laundering conference where a prosecutor said he didn't need a predicate crime to investigate a SARS report. And I was kind of stunned to hear that, because when I wrote this thing, you did need to have a predicate crime, and apparently you don't need to have one now. So I'd ask you to comment on both of those things. Thank you.
The last one's easy. He doesn't. And he does not need the predicate crime. And one of the things that people like on our side have been asking for decades is a connection of all of these convictions to, or the Bank Secrecy Act reports to a predicate crime. And usually what happens is they catch somebody who's doing something else, whether it's drug dealing or whatnot, and then they go and they add everything on. And then money laundering wasn't even illegal. Well, I mean, you probably know, it wasn't a criminal act until 1986. So the other part,
Naomi, do you want to talk about convenience?
So convenience versus data. Yeah, I would say, first of all, it's probably a false dichotomy. Yes, there are things in the privacy space that are less convenient. There are also things that are more convenient. So it's just a matter of finding the tool. I don't think you always need to choose. Like one example I'll give you, Brave browser. So when you browse the internet, you know when you go to a web page and the text shows up immediately, but there's like a split second where there are white boxes, and then the pictures will all get filled in these white boxes. What's happening in that split second is a real-time bidding auction for your eyeballs, for your attention, right? And so all of that is taking up bandwidth. Basically what happens is the website sends out to all their ad partners, hey, Naomi is sitting in front of this web page right now. She really likes cats and ranting about privacy, and she really likes Cato. Who wants to bid on the opportunity to show her ads? All of this stuff is happening and using up bandwidth and making your internet connection slower, making pages slower to load. I use Brave browser, which blocks all of those ads. So companies don't get to profile me as easily, and the page loads much faster. Also, I don't pay for YouTube premium, and I don't get any YouTube ads because Brave blocks the YouTube ads. Like, there are all kinds of wonderful benefits from all of these tools. So I don't think you necessarily have to choose. But the second thing I would say is that even if we did have to choose, it's also more convenient for us to throw our trash on the street than find a trash can. It doesn't mean that as a society we should do it. And sometimes I remind people, like, instead of thinking about it from your own personal standpoint, which is more convenient for me right now, I'll just choose the most convenient, throw my trash out the window, that's better. It's kind of about like your rational self-interest, right? What's actually in your best self-interest is not to create a society that's filled with trash. Similarly, even if you don't feel personally affected by data collection, it's a question of whether you want to live in a society where whistleblowers and investigative journalists and opposition party members and dissidents and protesters, where they no longer have the option of privacy. Because that's what you're currently feeding right now in your choices. It's not just about you, it's about what kind of a society and future you're creating, what sort of a market signal you're giving in your choices. And if we do want to live in a world where those people can still exist and we can still have self-correcting mechanisms, then we need to, sometimes opt for things that may be less convenient, like finding that trash can and actually using it. Because as a society, sometimes we need to do these things to write a better future.
This is a deep question that kind of goes in line with that from a user online asking, if millions of reports sit in a government database untouched by law enforcement, why should people be concerned? If the government's not doing anything, is there any harm being done?
Yes.
I thought you'd enjoy that.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to chime in as well, but first of all, those reports are actually not going to sit there for long. In a world of AI, everything is just going to be increasingly logged. We're going to find patterns. You're not going to be questioned by authorities because you did anything wrong. It's because you flagged something in an algorithm that was made by some fallible human. And there are so many false positives in these. But yes, there's going to be more and more actioning on these things. And second of all, I would say, just on what Nick was saying earlier, that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing to have a totalitarian surveillance state where every single movement and activity we do is monitored. I would say that when you have a treasure trove of information, first of all, you have to think about who has access to that information and who will have access to that information in the future. So currently, all this data collection is already being used, and it would be crazy to suggest it's not, because the data collection industry, the data brokerage industry, is $1 trillion industry. So they're making a ton of money from your data. It's not that it's not sitting there, it's absolutely being used. It's just not being used by law enforcement to catch criminals, to actually throw bad guys in jail. It's being used and sold to everyone else. It's being sold to hostile foreign nations that are trying to influence you by profiling you and showing you the exact content that they want you to see in order to change your worldview, in order to get you to vote in a particular way, because it knows you so well. It knows when you're feeling down and when you're more likely to click on something. And so that's when they'll push messages to you. That's how granular this information control, these pipelines have become. So this stuff is absolutely being used. When it comes to law enforcement getting access to it, you also need to think about the future. Data doesn't go anywhere, right? Regimes come and go. Social norms change. Governments go in and out. Your data is forever. So that data that is sitting there is going to be sitting there forever. And any future regime or any future hostile nation that hacks into it, or any future regular hacker that gets into it, will get access to that information. Inevitably, invariably, because data breaches, just are so common these days. So you need to be thinking about that sort of thing. It's not whether this stuff's being used right now, it's whether it can be arbitrarily used in the future to target anyone that the government, 10 years from now decides that they don't like. And you may not be in the mainstream then. Social norms may have changed and you may be the outlier then. So you need to be thinking about all this.
Yeah, and it's not a left or right political issue.
No.
The whole idea behind the Bill of Rights is that you are protected from the government overreaching by doing certain things. This one in particular, with the Fourth Amendment and search and seizures, preventing a warrantless search of your property, maintains your sphere of privacy and your ability to maintain a private life. It could be anything. It could be a hostile Trump administration or a Biden administration. It doesn't matter. It would just be the only difference would be who they're going after. That is there to protect us, and it is absolutely ridiculous to say, "Oh, that's never going to happen in the United States." We already know those sorts of things have happened in the United States. When we did and obviously in other countries it can be much worse. Our neighbor to the north, Canada, had I would argue a bigger problem with the trucker protest and cutting off people's bank accounts, and these protections are important now, even for where we are. And we're sitting here saying what we would like, but what's going on is that people in the government constantly want to go in the other direction. So they still want to expand it even more. So that makes those protections all the more important. Mm-hmm. So it's critical. Even if it is just sitting in a warehouse, which it's not. But
Yes, right up front.
So I understand certain countries, China, North Korea, Iran, whatever. But let's say I want to order a pizza. Domino's sees I ordered my sausage pizza. Now I got a coupon. Well, my ex doesn't want Domino's knowing they ordered the pizza. So it's kind of like I'm getting a benefit. What in the United States is really being if we're not in some totalitarian regime, what are some examples that have happened here in the United States? You know, I can't move to West Virginia and live off in the woods off the grid. The property tax records will show I own the property. Then I'd be lonely. I won't be here at Cato. You know, we have cameras in here. There's hundreds of cameras in all the buildings walking down the street to get here. I had to RSVP. I have to wear a name tag. I can't go live off the grid. So what here in the United States really is bad happening to us? I understand all of our freedoms, but give some examples.
Imagine Joseph McCarthy with the Bank Secrecy Act in place. Imagine the civil rights movement taking place with the Bank Secrecy Act in place. I mean, those are massive, massive infringements on people's rights that took place without the government having the explicit ability to go and shut down your bank account.
And adding on to that, we've seen part of the pressure that has arisen in the debanking conversation, the conversation around people losing their bank accounts, is because they've been too risky for the banks under this system to keep on board. So again, I mentioned the most common reason that you'll have a suspicious activity report filed is that someone got near that $10,000 threshold for a currency transaction report. But a suspicious activity report is kind of like a strike against you. If you get a couple of those, banks need to offload you. They need to close your account because then regulators are going to come knocking at their door and say, why do you still have Nick as a client? Why do you still have Nick if you filed these suspicious activity reports? Something weird is going on.
Really good question, too.
And unfortunately, this brings me back to the confidentiality that we were talking about, where they can't tell me, though, that they closed my account because of that piece. It has to remain a secret. All they can say is, we're done. You have 30 days to get out of here. And we've been seeing more and more stories come up where this is not the same as an activist in Bahrain being targeted and kidnapped on the street. But it is a cost in a otherwise free nation that really it doesn't have a benefit to offset it. Another weird piece where this came up, although this is a little bit further in the past, is one of the less talked about motivations was when it became illegal for Americans to have gold. So 1933 executive order, it became illegal for Americans to hold gold, and that was actually one of the reasons that the Bank Secrecy Act had support, was members of Congress wanted to be able to specifically track and seize gold holdings that any Americans might have in secret. And you can say that's a small thing as well. I think it is a small thing in comparison to what people go through in Bahrain and Russia and Iran. But at the same time, those are real infringements on our rights, real infringements on our privacy used to go after us.
We also have to realize what's the difference between our country and some of these places that you mentioned. What needs to happen for us to get to a place like that? Well, totalitarian surveillance is one of the things that happens that transforms it from a society, a government that's very dangerous to its people. So that's important to think about. I love your analogy. Like, think of the most dangerous person you can imagine, right? The most awful, dangerous person. And now imagine that they just inherited the surveillance system you just said yes to. So it's not enough to look right now and say, well, I like the guy in power, right? What's this data hurting me?
I'm not an immigrant.
Yeah, we need to be smarter than that. And imagine what it's going to be like when the next administration comes in power. What about the next one? What about someone inheriting this system and we've put up all of the rails necessary to surveil every single person, know exactly who you talk to, what you talk about. Are you talking against the government? All right, well, we've made that illegal now. And suddenly we have a surveillance infrastructure that completely eliminates dissent in society. So it's a matter of deciding what can we do now with very little cost to us to stop that, right? The whole Constitution was written with exactly that in mind. How do we set this thing up right at the start? What kind of Bill of Rights do we put into place to stop this descending into some totalitarian nightmare? You know, it doesn't just end with the Constitution. We don't just say, okay, well, we did that, we never have to think about it again, because governments always want to kind of, you know, move the needle and expand and find this loophole and all that. We need to be constantly vigilant. And one of the things we need to be vigilant about right now is the surveillance state and how much it is encroaching. Because I think we are getting to a dangerous precipice. If we go over that cliff, you can't get it back. We're not just going to roll back the surveillance state and say, oh, let's just have a good person get into power. No, it's gone at that point. The government has been, you know, co-opted, and you will no longer have opposition parties or real elections or any of the things that we take for granted today. So it's a matter of just looking towards the future and just thinking, what kind of a future do we want to write? Okay, well, let's look at those checks and balances. One of them is the Fourth Amendment that has been eroded. How do we regain it right now and make sure that we are protecting people's privacy, protecting their right from the government to have all of these warrantless searches and seizures of our information.
And another thing I want to be vigilant about is we are over time. So to quickly end on an optimistic note,
Please.
we are having the right conversation right now by asking where the harms are, where the costs are, where the benefits are. What are they actually able to do? What is actually happening? And people outside of here, people watching the live stream and beyond, are also asking these questions, and that's something to be optimistic about. People are embracing new solutions to figure out, how can I reclaim my privacy in a world that seems to be cataloging me in ever more spreadsheets? So there's change happening on the ground, there's slow change happening in Congress, and hopefully that'll only continue to grow. So thank you all for joining us in person. Thank you all for joining us online, and we'll see you next time.